Hi there. Thanks for tuning in to In the Past Lane. This week, in the midst of this long period of self-quarantine due to the COVID-19 pandemic, I thought I'd change things up a bit and rerun an episode I recorded a few years ago. It's my interview with historian Nancy Bristow about her terrific book, American Pandemic, The Lost Worlds of the 1918 Influenza Pandemic. That's the pandemic from a century ago that killed 50 to 100 million people worldwide, including 700,000 Americans. I think you'll find it a fascinating conversation that raises many of the same issues we're wrestling with today. Everything from ineffective communication from the White House to popular resistance to business closures and social distancing. Okay, let's get to it. On September 7th, 1918, in the middle of World War I, a soldier at Camp Devins, a huge army base 35 miles outside of Boston, Massachusetts, was sent to the hospital in a state of feverish delirium. The initial diagnosis was meningitis, but the next day, 12 more men arrived at the hospital in a similar condition, and before long, the doctors changed their diagnosis to influenza. Soon scores and then hundreds of soldiers stricken with influenza flooded the hospital. Here's how one physician at the hospital described the situation. These men start with what appears to be an ordinary attack of influenza, and when brought to the hospital, they very rapidly develop the most vicious type of pneumonia that has ever been seen. 2 hours after admission, they have the mahogany spots over the cheekbones, and a few hours later, you can begin to see the cyanosis, that is, turning blue due to lack of oxygen, extending from their ears and spreading all over the face. It is only a matter of a few hours until death comes. It is horrible. We have been averaging 100 deaths per day. For several days there were no coffins and the bodies piled up something fierce. The great influenza pandemic of 1918-1920 had arrived in the United States, on its way to killing 670,000 Americans and between 50 and 100 million people worldwide. You are listening to In the Past Lane, the podcast about history and why it matters.
We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more
huddled masses yearning to breathe free.
Consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill.
That all men and women are created equal.
Give me liberty or give me death.
Nobody's free until everybody's free.
The government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
History matters because it's not just about the past. History's about us, here and now. It explains the world we live in and why things are the way they are. And history gives us insights into how to achieve a more just, peaceful, and prosperous future. So people, let's do this. Hi there, everyone. Welcome to In the Past Lane, the podcast about American history and why it matters. I'm host Edward T. O'Donnell, your historian at large, and this is In the Past Lane, episode 105, in which we explore the great influenza pandemic of 1918-1920. We are coming to you this week from the American Nurses Association studios, located in central Massachusetts. You can learn more about me, this podcast, and our guests at our website, inthepastlane.com, and on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and our YouTube channel. Guiding us along, as always, is our stalwart executive producer, who still hasn't gotten her flu shot yet, Lulu Spencer. So what's happening in the Past Lane this week? Well, we're still basking in the glow of the Red Sox winning the World Series. All I can say is, it never gets old. In my history department, we're busy interviewing candidates for a new position in U.S. history, and this is also the time of the semester when students register for next term's classes. So as chair of the department, I'm fielding a lot of emails from students trying to get into classes. But all that will be over soon enough. At least that's what I'm telling myself. In other news, I spent last Thursday and Friday at Harvard University attending the Sound Education Conference that brought together hundreds of people in the field of education who are podcasting, or thinking about podcasting, or they use podcasts in their classrooms, or they had their students make podcasts. I spoke on a panel titled Professors Who Podcast. It was super interesting and a lot of fun. And I also had a chance to see a lot of fellow history podcasters like Liz Covart of the Ben Franklin's World podcast, and Elizabeth Kahane Burbridge and Christine Cacciapawati from the Footnoting History podcast. And I got to see the great Nate DeMeo of the Memory Palace podcast deliver a talk and tell one of his amazing stories. And Dan Carlin was there from Hardcore History. Great stuff all around. And it seems really likely that there's going to be a second Sound Education Conference next year. Finally, just a quick reminder to check out our In the Past Lane merchandise. We have lots of t-shirts, hoodies, mugs, stickers, and more featuring the In the Past Lane logo and some of our slogans. But there are also dozens of history-themed t-shirts that say things like, historians against history repeating itself. And in fact, there are many variations on this theme, like history majors against history repeating itself, history enthusiasts against history repeating itself, history students against history repeating itself, and more. Plus, we have some t-shirts with awesome history quotes, like this one by George Orwell. The most effective way to destroy people is to deny and obliterate their own understanding of their history. And this one from Confucius. Study the past if you would define the future. People, you could take care of your entire holiday gift buying with In the Past Lane merchandise. Just go to inthepastlane.com and click on merchandise. Thanks. And remember, everything you buy brings us a little revenue to offset the costs of making this podcast. It's a total win-win. Okay, people, put on your surgical mask and hop in. Your journey in the Past Lane begins now. Here at In the Past Lane, we're marking the 100th anniversary of World War I by offering 2 episodes that focus on the Great War and its aftermath. In this episode, I speak with historian Nancy Bristow about the influenza pandemic of 1918-1920. In the next episode, I'll speak with historian Andrew Huebner about his new book, Love and Death in the Great War, which focuses on what motivated Americans to fight that war. And I also highly recommend that you listen to In the Past Lane episode 24, where I speak with historian Michael Nyberg about his book, The Path to War, How the First World War Created Modern America. Nancy Bristow, today's guest, is professor of history at the University of Puget Sound in Tacoma, Washington. She is the author of many books and scholarly articles, including Making Men Moral, Social Engineering During World War I. She's with me today to speak about her other book on World War I, American Pandemic, The Lost Worlds of the 1918 Influenza Pandemic. In the course of our discussion, Nancy Bristow explains the origins of the great influenza pandemic that raged across the globe in 1918-1920, how the movement of millions of people during World War I contributed to the spread of the pandemic, what made this particular strain of influenza so deadly, how public officials struggled to contain the pandemic by imposing bans on large public gatherings, including church services, how nurses played a pivotal role in caring for the sick and dying, why the pandemic, which killed nearly 700,000 Americans, was largely forgotten in the public memory, and why experts today fear the onset of another global influenza pandemic. Nancy Bristow, welcome to In the Past Lane.
Thanks for having me.
Well, I want to start off by asking you to tell our listeners how you came to write this book. I understand that you have a family connection to the great influenza pandemic.
It appears that I do, though I didn't know it when I first became interested. I was in that awkward phase that young faculty members often are, where you're finishing a book and you're not quite sure exactly what to do next. And in a conversation with my father on a backpacking trip, we somehow stumbled across the fact that my grandfather's parents had both died in a week. And I suddenly went, wait a minute. And my father was stunned that I didn't know that that's how my great-grandparents had died. I knew that my grandfather had been an orphan, but I didn't know the circumstances under which that had happened. Now, the awkwardness of this was that when I went to search for them in the U.S. Census, they actually appear in 1920.
Okay.
So they were victims of what is either the fourth wave of the pandemic or the first seasonal version of this virus once it had established itself. But in either case, they died, and the kinds of consequences for my grandfather were identical, whether you died in October 1918 or as they did in a week in late February of 1920. The consequences for him were the same.
Right, and for so many other people across the country over the period of roughly 2 years when the epidemic raged. So I guess one way to begin would be because this is really a medical story in many ways, what's the state of American medicine in 1918? Why don't we delve into that a little bit as a way to sort of set up the state of medicine and how prepared American doctors and nurses and medical professionals are when this epidemic begins to make itself known in 1918?
It's an awkward moment for them because it was a moment so full of optimism and a sense of accomplishment and sense of future possibility. So we are in an era in 1918 where they have been through what gets called the bacteriological revolution of the late 19th century, during which they actually are able to, with the technology of microscopes, identify the causal agent of a number of the worst diseases that mankind had faced, from yellow fever to the bubonic plague, malaria, dysentery, scarlet fever, bacterial pneumonia, whooping cough, even syphilis. They had identified the causal agents, which was allowing, in some cases, cure. In most cases, it allowed for much better prevention of disease. It was a moment, as a result, in which science was really ascendant in American culture. and in which there was great optimism that infectious disease could really be a thing of the past. People really were talking in that kind of language. Alongside that, you'd had the triumph of what today we might call regular or allopathic or Western medicine, what we think of as just medicine,
right,
for many in the United States, had triumphed over chiropractic, naturopathy, and all of the other what we today would call alternative medicine. So mainstream AMA-style medicine was in the ascendant. Science was absolutely in the ascendant. And the public was in agreement that these forces were going to actually keep them healthy in the future. Alongside that, you had the emergence of public health as an established profession and something that city and state governments were putting in place that then meant that they felt that they had the preventative and the educational structure in place as well to prevent the kind of thing that then reigned over them in 1918.
Right. It's the progressive era. So virtually every aspect of American life is being reshaped with notions of expertise and the marshaling of data and an incredible confidence that these things, whatever the problem is, whether it's crime or ignorance or poor public health, they all can be overcome by just applying the right measures and using data and such things. So American medicine reflects that optimism.
Exactly right. The belief in expertise and the belief in data, I think, are really important. And then also the idea that in turn you can turn to the government to intervene, to legislate, and to solve problems, that any problem is soluble if you have the right data and you have the right experts behind the right sort of forces of the public sphere.
Right. And of course, this is also in the context of World War I. So for the past couple of years, Americans have grown quite used to a very intrusive, or let's just say very activist government doing things that had never been done before on a scale never imagined before, but it was all done in the name of the war effort. So there's a lot that's setting up the way that people respond to the great epidemic. So why don't we move from there to sort of look at the epidemic? Could you give our listeners an overview of the great pandemic and its different waves and how it plays out just as in a general way around the world and the casualty statistics and things like that? And then we can start to drill down into some of the ways in which it rolled out in the United States.
Sure. And this has a scale that I think is incomprehensible to those of us alive today. The estimates, and again, they can only be estimates because the state of public health, if it's getting a foothold in the United States, it is virtually non-existent in many parts of the world. So the figures are guesstimates at best. But the belief is that something like 500 million people, a third of the population of the globe, was infected at some point during the four waves of this pandemic, leading to somewhere between 50 and 100 million deaths worldwide.
So 50 to 100 million people is a staggering figure.
A staggering figure, and it's true that it's staggering in the United States as well. In communities, morbidity rate or the rate of infection in given communities ranges from about a quarter of the population to as high as 40% in some places, with the reality that by the time this thing is finished, 675,000 Americans have died of it. That's more than 500,000 than would normally have died of the flu. It's enough to lower life expectancy in the United States in the year 1918 by 12 years.
Wow.
And what's horrifying about this is that the people are dying are not the regular flu victims. It's traditional in a country like the United States that at this point is industrialized, that most that would die from influenza would be the very young and the very old. Mm-hmm. And during this pandemic, about just under half of the mortality is individuals between the ages of 20 and 40. So the parents, the people running businesses, the people teaching school or policing the streets or working in public health or in medicine. So you can imagine the kind of social cataclysm that comes with it. This happens really quickly, too, and I think that's a really important part of the story. The first wave comes through in the spring of 1918, in April, in the United States, and probably it is in the United States that this thing has its origins. But because of regular influenza, nobody's particularly concerned about it. The only people who really notice that something unusual is going on, that this particular influenza seems worse in a number of its characteristics, are the epidemiologists of the U.S. military who do notice that something's happening. But the rest of the world isn't particularly interested until, of course, it makes its way to the Western Front and begins to sicken armies. Then the second wave arrives, and it's the real killer of the four waves. And it strikes at the end of August, and it strikes simultaneously in 3 different places worldwide, in Sierra Leone, on the coast of France, and in Boston. And it just takes off around the world from there. So that within a relatively short period of time, say 6 weeks, the entire United States is infected, or citizens on all coasts of the United States are now facing this illness, so it will hit different communities at different times and in different ways. The third wave will come often right on the tail of the second wave. So it depends on the city, but it might have a first wave that's really deadly in October, and by the end of December, see a new rise in illnesses and deaths. It tends not to be as severe as the second in terms of mortality figures, in terms of sheer numbers of people who die. And then again, there is clearly something that happens during the winter of 1919-1920. And again, whether that's the fourth wave of a pandemic or the first sort of yearly iteration of a new influenza, people disagree about it. It's not an issue that's of particular interest to folks, but it's clear that something's still going on that late.
Right. And there's so many factors at work here. And one of them clearly is that this is a pandemic that's driven both by war and by industrialization, that people are moving as never before, both within countries and then also around the world. And the war has put into uniform tens of millions of soldiers and moved them all around the world, and they are in close proximity to each other. There's just so many conditions that are in place for this pandemic to really go global and to, as you say, affect as many as 500 million people and kill 50 to 100 million people. So tell us a little bit more about how that plays a factor in it, that this is particular to this moment in terms of events like the war and trends like industrialization.
Both of those two things work hand in hand, there's no question, because with industrialization, our capacity to move individuals around the world, it's expanded exponentially, so that you have people moving from a small town in the backwoods of Alaska to the Western Front in Germany over the course of a very short period of time, and in the interim, spending a great deal of time in an army training camp where people are packed in like sardines. So alongside the capacity to move people quickly is this war that's going on, which is an industrialized war. So you have, again, the capacity for people to be moved from place to place quite quickly, and that really does foster the growth of the virus. The war has some other impacts as well, which is, I think, the fact that there is a war effort going on really undercuts some of the public health efforts to contain the pandemic. One of the most startling facts about the pandemic is that Woodrow Wilson, the President of the United States through this conflagration, never speaks publicly about the pandemic. Never. Quite different from our era.
Do you see that as a conscious decision to just sort of not, because I know one thing that you bring out, which is that public health officials felt they had to walk a thin line, which was to make the public aware of what was going on and what steps they could take, but also not to cause panic so that, entire police forces would quit and doctors and nurses wouldn't go to work, and it would spiral outward into a much larger catastrophe. So how do we explain Wilson's silence on that?
I think Wilson is playing a different game than the one the public health leaders are playing. The public health leaders are making their decision about what to say and what not to say out of fear that people will not fight the pandemic in the best possible ways. I think Wilson is prioritizing fighting the war over fighting the pandemic.
Right.
And that his interest really is winning this war, which is near its end, and the pandemic really needs to take a back seat in his mind. Now, that doesn't mean he's not willing to have certain things happen that are necessary for fighting the pandemic, but his unwillingness to publicly acknowledge its existence or to make that part of Americans' sort of public conversation in a nationwide way, I find really startling and frankly very troubling. I think it was one of the big mistakes that was made.
Yeah, so as President Wilson is choosing not to say anything, the pandemic is spreading across the United States. And tell us, how does the flu affect people? And this is another feature to it, which it seems that it affects people who are healthy, which is not the normal course. And it also seems to finish people off really quickly so that people get sick and then they're essentially dead in 3 days. And the reports that you cite from army encampments and from hospitals are, the doctors are writing with sort of a tone of astonishment at what they're seeing. And tell us a little bit more about how the flu actually affected people and what it was like for people to be infected.
And you're right to point out that it was an astonishing illness and a surprising illness for the reasons you were describing. And the symptoms, unfortunately, are also surprising and frankly horrific. it would begin like a normal case of the flu. And for most of us who've had the flu, we know there's nothing normal about having the flu. It's a miserable situation where you have a fever and you ache and you can't do anything.
Yes.
And for many people, that would pass and that would be all that happened to them. But for a lot of people, it would continue to worsen. They would go to a whole nother level, frankly, of agony. The pain in their joints and their muscles and often headaches would be excruciating. Fevers would run very high. Normally, the fever would be 103 to 105, but could spike much higher, often leading then to delirium. So imagine a parent by the bedside and trying to manage this. But it actually would get worse than this. In fact, having patients become unconscious would sometimes perhaps feel like a gift of sorts, because the patients would be in great pain. They would be prostrated, really unable to do anything for themselves. Very, very cold, so they might be going into terrible chills and shivering, but also very feverish, so very hot, so that sort of hot and cold situation. As this disease would enter its final course, often patients' lungs would begin to fill with liquid. They would talk about them looking like the lungs of the drowned.
Right.
And the lungs would be filled with a kind of a bloody, I realize this isn't pleasant, but a kind of bloody mucus mess is the only way to put it. As a result, they would be literally drowning in their own bodily fluids so that their hands, their faces might begin to turn purple and blue and eventually even black in some cases. And their orifices would often drain a kind of, some sort of bloody liquid. So again, those details aren't important in order to be gory. Those details are important because as we think about, so what was this like on the ground? Mm-hmm. If you were conscious, that's what you suffered through. And if you were a caregiver, and most people were cared for by a mother, a sister, a brother, maybe a father, that's what you were having to sit through. That's what you were having to try to deal with, in your own household with a loved one.
Yeah, pretty extraordinary descriptions. So how do public officials respond? We mentioned a little bit earlier about information campaign, but public officials with the U.S. Public Health Service and then also state and local health services do a variety of things. And one is to distribute information and tell people what to do if they feel sick and so forth. But there are also larger policies put in place and guidelines, such as banning public meetings, trying to encourage closure of schools, even churches. Tell us a little bit more about how some of these measures played out.
You're absolutely right. The first thing the public health people do is education. And for that, I think they should be applauded, and they did really quite remarkable work. The U.S. Public Health Service puts out a pamphlet, and they publish 6 million copies of it. The Red Cross puts out another pamphlet that they publish in 8 different languages. Alfred Crosby has a great quote. He's sort of the founding father of flu history, I think, of this pandemic. But he says that if influenza could have been smothered by paper, many lives would have been saved in 1918.
Right.
But of course, it takes more than publishing things and telling people what to do. And so there are these much more dramatic efforts made at the local level. And depending on the city and the state, how this would play out varied enormously. But they would try first the least invasive things, making sure that public transportation had its windows open, maybe shifting commute hours so that everybody wasn't trying to be on the trains at the same time. Relatively quickly, other measures were called for, usually leading to first the elimination of large public gatherings, large meetings. You wouldn't be holding city council meetings. You wouldn't hold PTA meetings. But even that, fairly quickly, it was clear wasn't enough. And on some level, because nothing was going to be enough, they would begin to close public amusements, bars, saloons, movie houses, theaters, soda fountains, and often alongside that, much more contested, schools and churches. The argument there, of course, was that children were perhaps safer being in school where good information could be disseminated, and also that churches were really essential for many people as they tried to weather this terrible storm. Those arguments didn't tend to sell very well. Some public health people did come down on the side of keeping schools open. Some of the major school districts in the country did stay open, but most of them did not. Usually schools were one of the first things to be closed. When those things didn't work, there was still more to do. Some cities would try quarantine, which was a good idea, but very hard to get through the public. Others would use public masking. In other words, people had to wear masks on the streets. Often that would begin with doctors and nurses, and then eventually the entire public would be asked to wear them or required to wear them in some places like Seattle. In the end, there was nothing that could be done that would very visibly stop this thing. What we do know today, thanks to really good research that's been done by people at the University of Michigan and the CDC, is these things that we call non-pharmaceutical interventions or public distancing. The closing things down, not letting people have big gatherings, that really worked.
Right.
That's the thing to do.
And one thing you note is that because the epidemic comes in 4 waves, and so it seems to go away and then it comes back again, that this has an effect of undermining confidence in public health officials and undermining people's will to obey these either suggestions or rules as the epidemic, hits its 2nd and 3rd and 4th wave. That's part of the story, is it not? That the events on the ground tend to influence how people responded to these efforts to control the epidemic.
That's exactly right. So you can picture when the 2nd wave comes and you have this is when the really massive mobilization against the flu takes place, and people are very willing to try anything they can to stop this scourge. They don't want to die. They don't want their family and friends to die. They want this thing to stop. So they go along for a while, and then the schools are reopened. Things seem to be getting better, and then it comes again.
Right.
And the second time around, people are much less willing to buy into it because they've seen that the first time around it didn't stop it, but they weathered it anyway. When the public health people ask for these restrictions a second time, the opposition is quite dramatic, and they're much less successful in preventing public gatherings or in closing down certain kinds of amusements. There's a great deal of business opposition, for instance, saloon keepers and movie theater owners saying, we can't do this again. You will destroy our businesses.
Right.
And people saying, I don't want you to do this. I want to be able to go to the movies and go to the saloon. So you're right that the nature of the illness itself makes the public health people's work extraordinarily difficult.
And one other dimension of the epidemic and how it played out that you note is that its impact varied based on class and race and other forms of status. Tell us more about that, how it's not that hard to imagine that being poor would put you in a worse position when it came to the epidemic. But tell us more about how that played out.
And what's tricky here is that it's not the virus itself that is affecting people differently. So it's not because you live in poor circumstances that you are immediately sicker, or because you are male or female or a person of a particular racial or ethnic group. What it's really about is the way people are treated because of who they are. It's what we call the social construction of disease, that disease experience is shaped by who you are.
Mm-hmm.
So if you are an African-American person living in Philadelphia, let's say, the city will open emergency hospitals for white people, but they will not open an emergency hospital for black people. It will be up to the black community of Philadelphia to get that work done. When their own African-American hospitals are full, the city is not going to do anything to help them open up more beds. And that will happen across the South, of course, as well, where you have segregated hospitals to start with. So if you are a person of color, your access to medical care is going to be undercut. If you're a poor person, imagine a poor family where the father is stricken with influenza and he's the primary breadwinner. When he is sick, they don't have any safety net. There's no, big bank account to fall back on. So a father losing work for a month or dying may make a family go hungry. They may lose their home. They may, in some cases, have children let out to orphanages because they can't care for them any longer. So to be poor during the pandemic meant the possibility of going hungry, of losing a home, of having your family split apart. And again, it's not because the virus made a poor person sicker than a well-to-do person, but partly because their circumstances put them so close to the line of tragedy and trauma. And then in turn, the one thing that did help was to have decent nursing. And again, the poorer you are, the less likely you were to have access to clean water, a sanitary location to live, good food that might sustain you through an illness. Those kinds of things, even just being able to stay reasonably warm at an even temperature that might make you feel a little bit better, those things weren't accessible to people without means at this historical moment.
And you mentioned nursing. That's another interesting part of the story. So the epidemic obviously is a major challenge for public health and for the medical profession. And I think one of the points that you make is that the epidemic has a profound impact on nursing and in many ways gives a big boost to the nursing profession, which is a profession dominated by women. How does that work?
You're absolutely right. This was one of the things I found most fascinating was As doctors wrote about the pandemic, most of them being male, and I came across very few records from female doctors because of the way the professions were gendered at that historical moment, the doctors would write about how horrifying this was, how devastating it was to their sense of themselves as practitioners, how they even thought about their profession, that there was sort of a nightmare from which they were sure they would never fully awaken. When nurses wrote about their own experiences, they shared that sense that what they were going through was horrific and great sadness about the losses that they were seeing, but they felt really useful and they felt really fulfilled in the opportunity to be so useful. And they would write in nursing school yearbooks and in letters home to family and friends that, I saw this terrible thing today, but then we had such a nice time tonight. I feel like part of a family. What we've done, it's like being on the front lines. And, we are as important as the men that are on the front lines. And they were treated that way by the culture. They were heralded in newspapers. They were heralded by camp commanders for the extraordinary work that they did, looking after, providing that caregiving that was really all that could be done for influenza patients. The impact of that in the aftermath is pretty interesting, that they leave the pandemic feeling really certain about the importance of their profession, but also with the need to continue the professionalization of their career. Because during the pandemic, there's a lot of calls for volunteer nursing, right, and this mistaken belief that all you need to do to be a nurse is know how to, dampen someone's forehead. And they're very worried that the pandemic will undercut what they see as this professionalizing status that they're taking on. But they will take care of that with some interventions and with some new decisions in the nursing profession that will allow them to maintain the status that they had won during the war and during the pandemic.
So that's a lasting positive legacy of this great disaster. But as great a disaster as it was, perhaps the most amazing aspect of it is how quickly Americans forget it and leave it behind, and it becomes a kind of a lost story for a very, very long time. Historians have begun to recover it in recent times, but why is it that Americans forgot the great epidemic or great pandemic of 1918 to 1920?
I think a couple of things are functioning. Most importantly, and most simply, it's a story that doesn't fit with who Americans see themselves being. We have, as a country, industrialized. We are now a world power. We leave the war triumphant with this sense that we went to Europe and saved France, that we were responsible for the victory in World War I. So the nation is sort of bursting with pride and a sense of strength. The flu pandemic story doesn't resonate for people. It's not the story that people want to be telling. They want to be telling another story about the United States, about progress, about success, about national power, and a continued optimistic vision about the future that we see played out over the course of the 1920s in some ways. I think also because it takes place at the same time of the war, there's a mechanism for forgetting. Mm-hmm. You can subsume the pandemic as part of the war so that those losses become meaningful. Well, they died in the flu, but that was part of winning the war. So that you can remember them, but then forget them by saying, but that war, remember, we won that. We won that thing. And you only need to remember the war. You can forget about the pandemic. And it seems that it's the war, not the pandemic, that Americans choose to remember, whether you think about literature or monuments in town squares or things published in newspapers 1 year later. It's the war that gets that public acknowledgement, not the pandemic.
Right. And it seems to me, just thinking about this, that maybe another factor is the nature of the event itself, which was it's not Oklahoma City bombing or Hurricane Katrina or something that's sort of located somewhere. It's literally everywhere. So how would you build a monument to remember the pandemic? I mean, it certainly could be done because there's many ways to...
We built monuments to World War I and we did not build monuments to the flu, which is interesting.
Yeah.
And one thing that we need to make really clear when we talk about Americans forgetting is we're really talking about Americans in their public culture and what they talk about and celebrate or publish in the newspapers or put in their newsreels. At the level of the private, of course, people remembered this.
Right.
Right? Because people were living with the loss of a mother or a sister or an uncle or a great aunt. Or they were themselves debilitated by an after effect of the influenza, which did have some serious long-lasting health consequences for some people. So we want to be really careful as we talk about it being forgotten that it's worse than that, which is that people remembered it, but no one acknowledged it. And we know that for those who suffer through a really traumatic event, the most important part of sort of coming to terms with the trauma and building a life that works in its aftermath is for people to hear your story and to really hear it, For you to be able to tell it and for someone else to really hear it helps you manage that sense of loss and trauma. And that didn't happen for the victims of the pandemic. It just didn't.
Right.
And for me, that's a great tragedy.
Yeah, and in some ways that sort of explains why it wasn't a major story when you were growing up. You had to sort of ask a couple of questions to get to the answer.
Yeah.
It just seems like it receded or was sort of pushed back into the corners of public memory.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that leads to the question I always end my interviews on, which is, why does this matter now? Clearly, this story of the pandemic matters now, if only because it's hitting the century mark. It's 100 years ago when this took place. But what else is in this story of epidemic and public health and World War that is relevant to our times now? Like, are there some takeaways that we can find some meaning in them in 2018?
I actually think there really are. And the most obvious one for me, and it's the place you have to begin, is we have to realize that something like this could happen again. And I'm not a fear-mongerer. I'm not someone who wants people to be anxious all day, every day. But I think we have to come to terms with the reality that the conversations about emergency preparedness around health are real and they're important. And you can look at 1918 to see what it looks like when you're not really very well prepared, when the public doesn't quite understand, and the kinds of bad choices that then can be made not only by the public, but by public health. And that would lead me to another one, which is, I think, the importance of the public health leadership, preparing the public and trusting the public. I think this fear that the public will panic and go into complete, mayhem is incorrect, that the public can be trusted. What the public needs is really good, straightforward information. And I think that's the position that the public health leadership in the country takes today, and I applaud them for that. But that means then that the rest of us have to listen to them. At a moment of really low trust in the government, whether you're from the left or the right, whatever your politics, there's a very low regard for government. I hope that people can put public health leadership to the side of that distrust, because we need the public health leadership and we need to do what it is that they suggest if we want to stay as healthy as possible. And I'd add two other quickly, though I think they're also important. One is, one of the lessons that's very clear to me in 1918 is how terrible the experience of this illness was for so many Americans, because they operated from a position of great disadvantage, whether they were poor, they were a person of color, they didn't have access to medical care, they didn't have access to adequate resources to take care of themselves. We can't let that happen in 2018, and yet we're set up to do exactly that.
Yeah.
And then finally, I think this issue about empathy and memory, that if we should suffer through something like this, it will be up to the medical people, it will be up to the public health leaders to help us navigate it. But it will be up to each of us, it will be up to what I call the lay people, to handle the aftermath, to do the remembering, to do the listening that will be required to help a country and help communities and help individuals put lives back together in its aftermath. And if there's one thing I learned, it's that letting people tell even the hardest stories is very, very important, and something that any of us can do.
Indeed. Well, let's hope that there isn't a catastrophe around the corner, but as historians, we know that we know a number of things. One is that you never can predict the future, and we also know that it's very likely that something pretty dramatic is around the corner. I heard an epidemiologist interviewed on NPR back during the winter when this particular year's flu was seen as quite severe, and the person asked him, would it be possible for there to be another global pandemic? And he said, it's the thing I think about every night as I go to sleep, and it pops into my head every morning when I wake up. So people who know about such things are worried that we are poised, again, because of technology and travel and everything else, and also medicine, the fact that we've created medicines that are creating more resistant strains of viruses, that danger is very much out there. So your book and the story of the pandemic do offer some insights.
I hope so. And as you say, I'm just old enough where I also lived through a period when we really thought infectious disease was going to be a thing of the past. They were eliminating polio and smallpox when I was a young child, and then AIDS came along. And since then, we've recognized all of these other ways in which infectious disease is with us and will continue to be. And so there's, again, to be ready for it is different from living in fear. I don't think people should live in fear, but we should be attentive to the realities that the world holds.
Indeed. Well, Nancy Bristow, this has been a great conversation, and your book is terrific, and I thank you for taking the time to talk to us about it at In the Past Lane.
Well, this has been my great pleasure. Thank you so much.
Nancy K. Bristow is the author of American Pandemic. The Lost Worlds of the 1918 Influenza Pandemic, published by Oxford University Press and available everywhere. Okay, people, that's all for this episode of In the Past Lane. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you like what you've heard, please subscribe to this podcast at Apple Podcast, Stitcher, Overcast, Spotify, or wherever you access your podcasts. I'm In the Past Lane's host, Edward T. O'Donnell, your historian at large, reminding you that history explains our world. So let's pay attention to it. Thanks for listening. We hope you'll join us next time for another journey in the Past Lane. Hey, Lulu, people want to know, you got any hobbies?
I like alphabetizing the names of America's top serial killers.
SBI, Snoring Beagle International.